My father, the Duke, gave me to a man he considered no better than a slave. He did it as a punishment, a final, cruel act to erase me from the world that had always rejected me. He thought he was sentencing me to a life of shame and obscurity. In a remote cabin at the edge of his lands. He had no idea he was actually sending me home. For 25 years, my name was Lady Seraphina Sterlingworth, but my real title was disappointment. In a society that measured a woman's worth by the narrowness of her waist and the power of her marriage prospects, I was a currency my father could not trade. To the glittering world of the court, I was an embarrassment. To my own family, I was a burden to be hidden. So, they decided to dispose of me. My prison was to be a small, rough cottage. My keeper, a silent, powerful blacksmith named Cale, a man bound to my family by an old debt. I was his reward for a lifetime of service. He was to be my punishment for a lifetime of failing to be what they wanted. I walked into that new life expecting cruelty, bracing myself for neglect. What I did not expect was to be seen, truly seen, for the first time in my life, by the one man who had every reason to resent me. But this is not just a story about finding kindness in an unexpected place. This is a story about a secret. A secret that lay dormant for 30 years, hidden in the pages of a forgotten diary, waiting to be discovered. It's a truth about a forbidden love that defied a kingdom, about a child whose identity was a lie, and about a betrayal so profound it connected me to my silent keeper in a way fate could never have intended. This is the story of how the woman they threw away learned to fight back, not with swords or armies, but with a truth that could shatter an empire of lies. It's a story that proves that sometimes, the greatest punishments are just destiny in disguise, leading us exactly where we need to be. Welcome to Heartland Confessions. Before we begin, please leave a like on this video if you believe in the power of truth, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that will make you question everything. Now, let me tell you how my life ended, so a new one could finally begin. The air in the Sterlingworth Manor ballroom was thick enough to be sliced with a dinner knife. It was a suffocating blend of French perfume, beeswax from 1,000 candles, and the cloying sweetness of unspoken cruelties. From my seat in the velvet-draped alcove, I watched the dancers twirl across the marble floor, their silks and satins whispering against each other like co-conspirators. They were a kaleidoscope of glittering jewels and practiced smiles, a constellation of beautiful people whose light only served to make my own shadow feel darker and heavier. My name is Lady Seraphina, daughter of Duke Alistair Sterlingworth. And in a world that valued women by the narrowness of their waist and the strategic advantage of their marriage, I was a failure on an epic scale. I was not slender. My body, unlike the delicate, bird-like frames of the other ladies, had substance. It had curves and weight, things my father's world considered a currency of shame. My gowns, always in the darkest shades of sapphire or emerald, were engineering marvels of corsetry and clever draping, designed not to adorn but to contain, to minimize, to apologize for the space I occupied. That night, the annual autumn gala, was a particularly refined form of torture. I knew my role was to be a decorative piece of furniture, seen but not engaged with. I had mastered the art of blending into the damask wallpaper, of holding a glass of untouched champagne with a look of serene contemplation, as if I were above the frivolous chatter. It was a lie, of course. Inside, I was a cathedral of silent screams. I watched as Lord Harrington, a man whose lands bordered our own, held court near the grand fireplace. He was all polished boots and a predatory smile, the very man my father had been unsubtle pushing in my direction for months. My father believed a union with the Harrington family would solidify his power in the territory, and he was willing to overlook my shortcomings if it meant securing the deal. Harrington, however, was not as pragmatic. Look at her, I heard him sneer to his cohort of sycophants, his voice a low poison that still managed to carry across the room. He made a subtle gesture in my direction. They expect me to tether myself to that? I'd need a stronger anchor for my ship. A ripple of cruel, muffled laughter followed. It was not a roar, but a quiet, sharp puncture to the heart. I kept my face a perfect mask of indifference, my eyes fixed on a tapestry depicting a mythical hunt. But beneath the layers of silk and whalebone, my skin burned with shame. My hands, hidden in my lap, clenched into fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. The most painful part was not the insult itself. It was the sight of my father, standing not 20 feet away, watching the entire exchange. He saw the sneer. He heard the laughter. He did nothing. He didn't defend my honor. He didn't challenge the man who had publicly debased his daughter. Instead, a flicker of something passed over his face, not anger at them, but a deep, cold disappointment in me. As if my very presence, my very form, had invited the mockery. He turned away, a silent dismissal that was louder than any shout. In that moment, I knew I wasn't just an embarrassment to him, I was a stain he wished he could scrub from the family name. The following morning, I was summoned to his study. It was a room I had always hated, a mausoleum of dark mahogany, leather-bound books that were never read, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors who judged me from their gilded frames. My father sat behind his massive desk, the light from the tall window illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, but not the warmth in his heart. "Serafina," he began, not bothering with pleasantries. His voice was like the snap of a frozen twig. "Your performance last night was, as usual, a profound disappointment." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Lord Harrington has made it clear he has no intention of proceeding with a proposal. He continued, steepling his fingers. And frankly, I can no longer blame him. I have paraded you at every gala, every cotillion, every charitable event for 3 seasons. The result is always the same. Mockery. Whispers. You have failed to secure a single offer of merit. You are a liability to this family's reputation. Each word was a carefully aimed dart. I focused on a point on the wall behind him, a small crack in the plaster, and poured all my energy into not letting the tears fall. "However," he said, his tone shifting to something even more chilling, "an opportunity has arisen to make use of you. A way to finally turn your unique situation into an asset." I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. "What do you mean, father?" "There is a man in my service," he said, looking at a ledger on his desk as if I were merely an entry in it. "A blacksmith on the northernmost edge of the estate. A man named Cale. He is a formidable worker, but his family incurred a significant debt to my father years ago, a debt he has been unable to repay." I stared at him, confused. What did this have to do with me? "This man," my father went on, a cruel, thin smile playing on his lips, "has served me well. He is strong, silent, and knows his place. I have decided to reward his service and settle his family's debt in a single, efficient transaction. He has asked for a wife to help him manage his homestead." The air in the room grew thin. The portraits on the wall seemed to lean in, their painted eyes glinting. I could feel the scream building in my throat, but it was trapped behind a wall of ICE.my father finally lifted his eyes from the ledger and looked directly at me. His gaze was devoid of any paternal affection. It was the look of a merchant assessing a piece of damaged goods. "You, Serafina, will be his wife. You will be his reward. I will deliver you to his forge by the end of the week. Your life here, in society, is over. You will be removed from view, and in return for this marriage, the blacksmith's debt will be cancelled. It is a punishment for your failures, and a pragmatic solution to 2 rather vexing problems. You have made yourself unsuitable for the world of nobles. Perhaps you will find your worth in the world of dirt and sweat." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as shards of glass. He had not just disowned me. He had not just banished me. He had sold me. He had turned his own daughter, his own blood, into a form of currency to pay off a common laborer. And he had wrapped the entire, monstrous act in the guise of a reward. I stood there, frozen in the cold, silent study, the ancestors on the wall my only witnesses. The shock was a physical blow, so absolute it left no room for tears. In that moment, I understood. My life at Stirlingworth Manor was over. My father had cast me out, not into the street, but into a different kind of prison, a life I couldn't possibly imagine, with a man I had never met, in a world I was not built to survive. My punishment had begun. For 2 days, I existed in a state of silent, suspended shock. I moved through the gilded halls of Stirlingworth Manor like a ghost, my own spirit having already departed my body. The servants, once so deferential, now looked at me with a new, unnerving mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Their whispers followed me down the corridors, the news of my banishment having spread through the staff like a fever. I had not just fallen from grace, I had been erased from the ledger of relevance. I was no longer Lady Seraphina. I was a cautionary tale whispered over laundry baskets and polishing rags. My mother's lady's maid, a stern woman named Beatrice who had served our family for 30 years, was tasked with helping me pack. The Duke has instructed that you are to take only practical items, she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. 2 traveling dresses, sturdy shoes, undergarments, a winter cloak. Her hands, usually so gentle when handling my things, were now brisk and efficient, as if she were packing away linens for storage. One by one, the symbols of my life were deemed unnecessary. The silk ballgowns, the embroidered slippers, the velvet riding habits, all were left hanging in the cavernous wardrobe, ghosts of a life that was no longer mine. Beatrice paused when she reached my jewelry box. She opened it, its contents glittering under the morning light. She selected a simple silver locket, the one my own mother had given me on her deathbed. This, perhaps, is practical enough, she conceded, a flicker of something, pity, in her eyes. Everything else, the pearls, the garnets, the diamond earrings from my debut, was closed away. As she worked, I sat by the window, looking out at the manicured gardens, the perfect, symmetrical lines of the hedges, the fountain, where water danced in a never-ending, pointless ballet. It all seemed like a painting from a life I had only dreamed. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching a play about someone else's misfortune. When Beatrice left, I moved to my bookshelf. It was my only true sanctuary in this house. Books of poetry, philosophy, history. They were my friends. My confidants. I knew I couldn't take them all. My trunk was small, my new life smaller still. My fingers brushed over the worn leather spines until they found a thin, unassuming volume, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. It had been a gift from my tutor, a man my father had dismissed for filling my head with unladylike notions of equality. It was a book of rebellion, of finding beauty in the common, the overlooked. I slipped it into the folds of my cloak, a secret act of defiance. It was the only part of my true self I would take with me. The morning of my departure arrived with a cold, relentless rain that matched the gray emptiness in my soul. There were no goodbyes. My father did not grace me with his presence. I was escorted by 2 footmen to a simple, sturdy carriage, not the family's crested coach. My single trunk was loaded, the sound it made hitting the floor of the carriage echoing the finality of it all. The journey took most of the day. We rode north, leaving the pristine lawns and sculpted gardens of the main estate behind. The paved road gave way to a muddy track, and the landscape transformed. The orderly, park-like woods became a tangled, wild forest of imposing pines and ancient oaks. The world grew darker, rougher, more primal. It was as if the carriage were traveling not just through miles, but through centuries, taking me back to a more brutal and unforgiving time. The rain beat a mournful tattoo on the carriage roof. I didn't look out the window. I simply sat, my hands clasped in my lap, the small book of poems a hidden weight against my leg. I was a parcel being delivered, nothing more. Late in the afternoon, the carriage lurched to a halt. The door was opened by the coachman, who avoided my eyes. "We've arrived, my lady," he muttered, his use of my title now sounding like a cruel joke. I stepped out, my sturdy shoes sinking immediately into a mire of mud and dark, wet soil. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, damp earth. And something else, the sharp, metallic scent of hot iron. Before me was a scene torn from a peasant's cautionary tale. A large, open-sided structure, more of a shed than a building, housed a great, roaring fire. This was the forge. Its heart was a massive anvil, scarred and beaten. Tools I couldn't name hung from the walls, dark and menacing. Attached to this workshop was a small, grim-looking cottage built of rough-hewn logs and stone, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney and disappearing into the gray, weeping sky. Then I heard it. A steady, rhythmic clang. Clang. Clang that seemed to shake the very ground. And from the shadows of the forge, a man emerged. He was not what I had expected. The word blacksmith had conjured images of a brutish, stooped creature. The man before me was tall, built with the solid, powerful grace of an oak tree. He was drenched in sweat and soot, his bare arms corded with muscle that shifted under his skin as he moved. His hair was a tangle of dark, unruly curls, and his face was all sharp angles and shadows, dominated by a pair of intense, focused eyes that seemed to burn with the same heat as his fire. He held a massive hammer in one hand as if it were a natural extension of his arm. He stopped his work when he saw the carriage, his hammer falling silent. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise. He wiped a hand across his brow, leaving a streak of black soot, and looked at me. It was not a leer. It was not a look of triumph or pity or even curiosity. It was a gaze of profound, unnerving neutrality. He looked at me the way a carpenter might look at a piece of wood, assessing its grain, its flaws, its potential use. The coachman and a footman unloaded my trunk, dropping it onto the muddy ground near my feet with a heavy thud. They climbed back into the carriage without a single word or a backward glance. The crack of the whip echoed through the clearing, and the carriage rumbled away, its wheels churning the mud. It disappeared into the trees, leaving me utterly and completely alone with the blacksmith. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, separated by 10 yards of rain-soaked earth. The only sounds were the hiss of the rain on the hot metal of the forge and the steady drip of water from the eaves of the cottage. I waited for him to speak, to mock me, to give an order, to do something. But he remained silent, his gaze steady. Finally, when the silence had stretched to the point of breaking, he spoke. His voice was not what I expected either. It was a low, rough baritone, like the sound of stones grinding together deep underground. It was not unkind, nor was it kind. It was simply a sound of fact. "The house is there," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the cottage. "You can go inside." And then, he turned his back on me, walked back to the anvil, and lifted his hammer. The rhythmic, deafening clang began again, each strike a hammer blow against the fragile shell of the woman I used to be. I was left standing in the rain, a lady with a single trunk, a useless title, and a secret book of poems, abandoned at the door of my new life. My first instinct was to remain rooted in the mud, to let the cold rain soak me to the bone until I became one with the wretched earth. To move, to accept the shelter of that rough cottage, felt like a form of surrender. But the biting wind had no regard for pride, and the shivering that had started in my hands was now a violent tremor shaking my entire frame. Defeated, I dragged my trunk across the muddy ground, the bottom of it scraping against hidden stones, and pushed open the heavy wooden door of the cottage. The world inside was not what I expected. I had braced myself for squalor, for the stench of unwashed bodies and spoiled food. Instead, I was met with the clean, sharp scent of pine wood, wood smoke, and something else, dried lavender. The cottage was a single, large room, but it was meticulously organized. A great stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. Beside it, firewood was stacked in a perfect, geometric pile. A sturdy table, its surface sanded smooth and showing the beautiful grain of the wood, stood in the center with two simple, hand-carved chairs. In one corner was a sleeping pallet, neatly made with thick, dark wool blankets. In another, a small area for cooking, with iron pots hanging from hooks and a few earthenware jars lined up on a shelf. It was the home of a man who lived with intention. There was no clutter, no waste, no softness. But there was order. There was dignity. And this clean, functional austerity was somehow more intimidating than the filth I had prepared myself for. It spoke of a man who was self-contained, who needed nothing, whose world was whole without me in it. I was not just an intruder, I was an irrelevance. I stood dripping in the doorway until the sound of the hammering outside stopped. A moment later, Cale entered, filling the space with his sheer presence. He did not look at me, but went to the fire, stoking the embers and adding a fresh log. The flames licked to life, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He then moved to the cooking area, ladling a thick, dark stew from a pot into two wooden bowls. He placed one bowl on the table, along with a hunk of dark bread. He gestured for me to sit. It was a command, yet it was not unkind. I moved stiffly, my wet cloak heavy on my shoulders, and sat. He took his own bowl and sat not at the table with me, but on a low stool by the fire, his back mostly to me. We ate in absolute silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the scrape of my spoon against the wood of the bowl. The stew was simple, root vegetables and some kind of tough meat, but it was hot and nourishing. Every swallow felt like a betrayal of my own misery. I was supposed to be suffering, yet I was being fed. I was meant to be a punishment, yet I was being sheltered from the storm. After he finished, he rose, took his bowl to the wash basin, and cleaned it. He then pointed to the sleeping pallet in the corner. "That is yours," he said. He then gestured to a small, adjoining door I hadn't noticed. "I sleep there." He disappeared through the door, closing it softly behind him. He did not say good night. He did not say anything more at all. I was left alone in the main room, the firelight casting a warm glow on my damp clothes. He had given me the larger space, the main bed. He had fed me. And he had shown me a level of respectful distance a duchess would grant a queen. This was not the behavior of a brute claiming his prize. My father's punishment was becoming more confusing by the minute. What fresh hell was this, to be thrown into a cage only to find the door left unlocked? That first night, I did not sleep. I lay on the pallet, fully dressed, listening to the rain on the roof and the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing from the other room. My mind raced. I had spent my life in a world of complex rules, of veiled insults and false smiles. Every action had a hidden meaning, every word a double purpose. But this man, this Cale, he was a creature of infuriating simplicity. He worked, he ate, he slept. He had not smiled, nor had he frowned. He had simply been. And his quiet, powerful indifference was a greater torment to my pride than any cruelty would have been. The next morning, I woke to find him gone. The fire was already roaring, a fresh pot of something that smelled like chicory coffee warming by the embers. Through the single window, I could see him at the forge, his silhouette dark against the fire, the rhythmic clang of his hammer already echoing through the misty dawn. A day passed. Then another. A routine formed from our shared silence. He would rise before dawn and work until dusk. I would remain in the cottage, a prisoner in a cell with no bars. I had nothing to do. My hands, accustomed to the delicate work of embroidery, or the turning of a page, were now idle. The feeling of uselessness was a new and profound kind of agony. I was an ornament, and I had been moved to a room with no one to admire me. On the third day, I could bear it no longer. The idleness was a poison. I needed to do something, anything, to prove to myself that I still existed. I found a broom and swept the stone floor. I washed the 2 bowls and the single pot from the night before. I straightened the wool blankets on my pallet until they were perfectly smooth. While tidying the small shelf above the fireplace, my fingers brushed against a small object tucked behind a jar of dried herbs. It was a bird, carved from a single piece of a light-colored wood, no bigger than my thumb. I picked it up. It was exquisitely detailed, each feather etched with impossible delicacy, its head tilted in a posture of curious life. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. It was the work of an artist, of someone with patience and a deep appreciation for beauty. It did not belong in this world of soot and iron. I looked out the window at the man swinging his heavy hammer, his movements all power and brute force. How could he and this delicate thing coexist? I quickly put the bird back, a strange fear mixing with my confusion. When Cale came in that evening, his routine was the same. He stoked the fire, prepared the meal, and sat on his stool. But as he looked up, his eyes briefly scanned the room, noticing the swept floor, the tidy corner. He said nothing. But as he passed by the table to get water, he paused. "The stew is on the hearth," he said, his back still to me. "You can serve it." It was not a thank you. It was not praise. It was a simple statement of fact, a tiny crack in the wall of silence between us. It was a delegation, an acknowledgement that I was not just a breathing statue in his home, but a presence capable of action. It was the first time in my new life that I had been given a purpose, however small. And to my own profound shame, my heart leapt with a pathetic, desperate gratitude. The act of serving the stew became a silent turning point. It was a task, a purpose, and I clung to it like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. From that day forward, I began to claim the cottage as my domain. Not because I was ordered to, but because the alternative, to sit and stare at the 4 walls while my soul atrophied, was a fate worse than any my father could have devised. I learned the rhythms of the small house. I learned that the fire needed a fresh log just as the morning light began to gray, and another as the evening shadows grew long. I learned to identify the different dried herbs hanging from the rafters: chamomile for sleep, mint for tea, rosemary to scent the stew. I learned to sweep the stone floor in a way that didn't raise too much dust and to wash our 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and single iron pot with a careful economy of water from the rain barrel. These small, domestic rituals became the architecture of my days, the only thing giving them shape and meaning. My life became a study in observation. From the cottage window, I watched Cale. I watched him for hours, for days. My initial perception of him as a brute, a mere instrument of my father's cruelty, began to dissolve in the heat of his forge. I saw the way he moved, not with anger, but with a deep, focused intention. His hammer did not just crush the metal, it persuaded it. There was a conversation happening between the man and the iron. A language of fire and force that I could not understand but could, to my surprise, appreciate. I saw the same precision that had crafted the tiny wooden bird in the way he shot a horse for a traveling farmer, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he calmed the nervous animal. I saw it in the way he mended a broken plow, his brow furrowed in concentration as he analyzed the break before heating the metal. He was not just a laborer, he was a master of his craft. He was an artist whose medium was not clay or paint, but fire and iron. This realization was profoundly unsettling. My father had thrown me away, given me to a man he considered little more than an animal, yet this man possessed a skill and a quiet dignity that was absent in every powdered and perfumed nobleman I had ever known. One afternoon, about a fortnight into my exile, I was attempting to chop a large turnip with a knife that was far too dull. I was clumsy, unaccustomed to such rough work. My focus lapsed for a second, and the blade slipped, slicing deeply into the side of my thumb. I cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and surprise, dropping the knife with a clatter. Blood welled up instantly. A shocking, vibrant red against the pale skin of my hand. Before I could even press a cloth to the wound, the cottage door flew open. Cale stood there, his work at the forge abandoned. He saw the blood and crossed the room in 2 long strides. He took my hand in his, turning it over to inspect the cut. His touch was not rough, as I'd always imagined it would be. His fingers, though calloused and stained with soot, were remarkably gentle as they probed the edges of the wound. He said nothing. He simply led me to the wash basin, pumped fresh, cold water over my hand, and cleaned the cut with a startling efficiency. Then, from a small wooden box on a shelf, he took a clean strip of linen and a small earthenware jar. He opened the jar, and the clean, sharp scent of comfrey and yarrow filled the air. He applied the green-tinged salve to the cut and then wrapped my thumb tightly and securely with the linen bandage. His hands were steady, his movements economical and precise. He worked in the same focused silence with which he worked the iron. Throughout the entire process, which could not have lasted more than 2 minutes, he did not look at my face once. His entire attention was on my injured hand. When he was finished, he released me, gave a single, curt nod, and walked back out to the forge. The rhythmic clang of his hammer resumed as if it had never stopped. I stood by the basin, my heart pounding. It was the first time he had touched me. And it had been a touch of pure, functional care. There was no emotion in it, no tenderness. And yet, it was the most profound act of consideration I had received in years. He had seen a problem, an injury, and had fixed it. The simplicity of it left me breathless. My curiosity about him, already a small, glowing ember, was fanned into a flame. Who was this man who could tame fire and iron, who could carve a perfect bird from a block of wood, who could bind a wound with the skill of a physician? The single leather-bound book I had seen on his mantelpiece gnawed at me. It was a history of the founding families of the territory, a book I myself had in my father's grand library. What was a blacksmith doing with a book like that? A few days later, driven by a desperate need to break the suffocating silence, I made a decision. I prepared the midday meal, a thick soup and bread, and instead of leaving it on the table in the cottage, I carried the tray out to the forge. The heat hit me like a physical blow as I approached. The air shimmered, and the roar of the fire was a living thing. This was his world, a place of danger and elemental power. He was hammering a glowing piece of iron, his body a symphony of controlled violence. He didn't notice me until I was only a few feet away. He stopped, his hammer held in midair, and turned. Sweat dripped from his brow. He looked at me, then at the tray in my hands. I could see a flicker of surprise in his eyes before his neutral mask slipped back into place. I set the tray down on a large, flat-topped stump near the entrance of the forge. I brought you your meal, I said, my voice sounding small and thin in the vast, noisy space. He said nothing, only watched me. I felt my courage waver. I was wondering, I began, forcing the words out. The metal. How do you know? How do you know when it is ready to be shaped? He looked from my face to the glowing iron in the fire, then back to me. He laid his hammer down and came to the stump, picking up the bread. You don't know, he said, his voice a low rumble. You listen. Listen? The fire tells you. The color of the metal tells you. When it glows like the setting sun, it is ready to bend. When it glows like the moon, it is ready to harden. It has its own language. He spoke of the iron as if it were a living creature, with its own moods and desires. There was an unexpected poetry in his words, a depth I was not prepared for. My father, I said, then stopped, unsure how to continue. He believes things are either strong or weak, useful or useless. Cale took a long drink of water from a ladle. His eyes met mine over the rim. For the first time, his gaze was not neutral. It was direct, and it held a profound, ancient sadness. Your father is wrong, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Nothing is born strong. Iron must be heated to 1,000 degrees, beaten, and plunged into cold water. It is broken again and again to become a sword. The strongest things are the things that have been broken the most. He said it as a simple fact of his trade. But I heard it as a sermon. A piece of wisdom more true and more profound than any I had ever heard from a pulpit. He was talking about me. He was telling me my own story, the story of my future, in the language of his forge. His words about the iron and the sword echoed in my mind for days. The strongest things are the things that have been broken the most. It was a strange and uncomfortable comfort, a philosophy born of fire and force that seemed to explain my own life more accurately than any sermon or poem I had ever read. A subtle shift occurred between us after that day. The silence in the cottage was no longer a void, but a shared space. When I brought him his midday meal, he would nod in acknowledgement. Sometimes, as we ate our evening meal, me at the table, he on his stool by the fire, I would catch him watching me, his gaze no longer neutral, but filled with a quiet, contemplative intensity that I found myself wanting to understand the contradictions that defined him. The man who could swing a 10-pound hammer with brutal force was the same man who had carved the delicate, impossible bird I kept hidden on the mantel. The man who lived in a world of soot and cinders owned a book on the history of the territorial founders. The chasm between the man he was and the man he was supposed to be grew wider and deeper in my imagination, and I felt an insatiable urge to bridge it. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the north, a violent tempest that forced Cale to abandon the forge early. The rain came down in gray, impenetrable sheets, and the wind howled around our small cottage like a hungry wolf. He spent the afternoon sharpening tools, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel a counterpoint to the fury of the storm outside. I sat by the fire, mending one of his rough work shirts, my stitches small and neat. The domesticity of the scene was so profoundly at odds with the reality of my situation that it felt like a dream. He finished his work and sat for a long while, simply staring into the flames. The silence stretched, and in a moment of reckless bravery, I decided to cross a boundary. The book, I said, my voice quiet. On the mantelpiece. The one about the founding families. He did not turn, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly. What of it? It seems out of place here, I ventured. It is a book for scholars, for men who care about lineage and land. He was silent for a long moment. Then, without looking at me, he said, a man can care about where he stands, even if the ground beneath his feet is not his own. The cryptic nature of his answer only fueled my curiosity further. The storm raged outside, and a strange sense of confinement and intimacy filled the small room. Later that evening, after he had retired to his small adjoining room, I knew I could not wait any longer. I needed to see the book. My hands trembling, I took the heavy, leather-bound volume from the mantel. It felt heavy, important. I sat at the table, the firelight casting a flickering glow on the pages as I opened it. But it was not a passage of text that greeted me. The book had been used as a press, and tucked carefully between the pages of The Sterlingworth family history was a small, folded piece of parchment, and beside it, a single, perfectly preserved pressed flower. My fingers brushed against the flower first. It was a lady slipper, a rare, beautiful orchid with a deep purple hue. My breath caught in my throat. I knew this flower. They grew in only one place on the entire estate, a shaded, mossy glen near the small lakeside retreat my own mother used to frequent before she passed away. It was her favorite flower. With a growing sense of dread, I unfolded the parchment. It was not a letter, but a drawing, a portrait sketch of a woman's face, rendered with breathtaking skill in charcoal. She was beautiful, with high cheekbones and a serene, gentle smile. But it was her eyes that made the world tilt on its axis. They were an exact replica of my own. Not just the shape, but the color, a rare, specific shade of hazel green, flecked with gold, a color so unique that it was known as the Sterlingworth emerald, passed down through my mother's line. For generations. My mind, conditioned by a lifetime of courtly intrigue and my father's cruel machinations, pieced together a story with horrifying speed. This woman, this beautiful, serene woman with my eyes, must have been Cale's lover. A noblewoman. Perhaps even a relative of mine. My mother's retreat, the flower, it all pointed to a secret affair, a forbidden love. And Cale had my father known? Was my banishment, my marriage to him, some part of a larger, more twisted punishment I couldn't yet comprehend? A wave of something hot and acidic washed over me. It was jealousy. A raw, possessive jealousy that was as foreign to me as it was powerful. His kindness, his respectful distance, his cryptic words, were they all a sham? When he looked at me, did he even see me, Seraphina? Or did he only see the ghost of this other woman, the one whose eyes I had somehow inherited? The fragile bridge of respect we had started to build between us crumbled into dust. I did not hide my discovery. I left the book open on the table, the portrait and the flower laid bare for him to see. I sat in the chair, my hands clenched in my lap, and I waited. When he emerged from his room the next morning, he stopped dead in the doorway. He saw the open book. I watched as his stoic mask, the one he wore like armor, completely shattered. A look of such profound, naked grief washed over his face that it stole my breath. It was the look of a man seeing a wound that had never healed being torn open once more. He walked slowly to the table, his eyes fixed on the drawing. He did not look at me. His large, calloused fingers reached out and traced the outline of the woman's face on the parchment, a touch of such reverence and sorrow that it felt like a prayer. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "In your book," I replied, my own voice cold and brittle. "Who was she?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were the eyes of a stranger, filled with a history of pain I could not fathom. "Her name was Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She was, from a long time ago. Before the forge. Before all this." He gestured vaguely at the cottage, at our life. "I thought the memory of her was buried. And then, you came." He looked directly into my eyes, and his next words were the final, killing blow to the fragile hope that had begun to grow in my heart. "You have her eyes," he said. It was worse than any accusation of a secret affair. It was a confirmation of my deepest fear. I was not a person to him. I was a relic. A living ghost who walked and talked and breathed, but all he saw, all he would ever see, was the reflection of a dead woman he had once loved. I had escaped my father's house where I was judged for my body, only to land in a new prison where I was judged for my face, a constant, painful reminder of a love that was not, and could never be, mine, the revelation that I was a living effigy to a dead woman was a crueler blow than my father's banishment. A wall of ice descended between Cale and me, thicker and colder than the silence that had preceded it. We returned to our separate orbits, two silent planets in a tiny, miserable solar system. He would work, his hammer blows sounding more like accusations than creation. I would manage the cottage, my movements stiff with a new kind of despair. The small comforts I had found in the routine were gone, replaced by the bitter taste of being a substitute, a ghost. Every time he looked at me, I no longer wondered what he was thinking, I was certain I knew. He wasn't seeing me, Serafina. The woman who was slowly learning to find her footing in a harsh new world. He was seeing Alara, the ghost with my eyes. My face, the one feature I could not change or hide, had become my new prison. I had fled a cage where I was judged for my body only to be locked in another where I was judged for my resemblance to the dead. After a week of this cold, silent torment, a reckless anger began to smolder within me. I was tired of being a passive recipient of my fate. I was tired of being defined by other people's memories, other people's grief. If I was to be haunted by this Alara, then I would confront her ghost on my own terms. I would go to the one place that connected them, the place I now dreaded more than any other, my mother's old lakeside retreat, where the lady slipper orchids grew. One morning, I watched Kale disappear into the woods, heading towards the upper territories to fell a tree. I knew I would have the entire day. I packed a small satchel with bread, cheese, and a flask of water. Without leaving a note, without a backward glance at the cottage that had become my new prison, I started walking south, towards the lake. The journey took hours. I followed the familiar paths of my childhood, paths I had not walked in years. The forest was dense, the air cool and smelling of damp earth and pine. When I finally arrived, the place was just as I remembered it, only sadder, more neglected. The small stone and timber cottage stood by the edge of the lake, its windows filmed with dust, its porch sagging slightly. It was a place frozen in time, heavy with the memory of my mother, Lady Annalise. I pushed open the door, which creaked in protest. The air inside was stale, a mixture of lavender potpourri and decay. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting through the dirty windows. Her favorite shawl was still draped over a chair. A book of sonnets lay open on a small table, as if she had just stepped out for a moment. A wave of grief for the mother I had lost, and for the happy memories I now questioned, washed over me. Driven by an instinct I didn't understand, I began to search. I was not looking for anything specific, just a connection, a clue, anything that would make sense of the chaos my life had become. I ran my fingers over the dusty furniture, opened drawers filled with faded ribbons and pressed flowers. In the small writing desk, beneath a stack of old stationery, my fingers found a small, hidden latch. I pressed it, and a false bottom in the drawer clicked open, revealing a slim, leather-bound journal. It was my mother's handwriting. I knew it instantly. My heart pounded as I sat down in the dusty armchair and opened the first page. The early entries were filled with a familiar sadness, the lonely writings of a duchess trapped in a cold, political marriage. She wrote of my father's indifference, his absences, his focus on power and status. She wrote of this cottage as her only sanctuary, her only escape. Then, a new character entered the pages. A young man came to repair the stone wall by the lake today, she wrote. The stonemason's son. His name is Kale. He does not speak much, but his hands are not those of a laborer. They are the hands of an artist. He noticed the book of poetry I was reading. He has read it, too. I was so surprised. I read on, my breath catching in my throat. The entries became more frequent. She wrote of their conversations, their shared love of history and art, the way he looked at her not as a duchess, but as a woman. He started bringing her things, a perfectly carved wooden bird, a rare lady slipper orchid he found deep in the woods. My blood ran cold. The bird on the mantelpiece. The flower in the book. They were not from Alara to Kale. They were from Kale to my mother. Then I found the sketch. Tucked into the back of the journal was the very same charcoal portrait. And beneath it, in my mother's delicate script, was a caption. My Kale drew this. He calls me his Alara, his swan, because he says I only show my true grace when I am here, away from the cage of the court. I have never felt so seen. Alara was not another woman. Alara was my mother. I felt a dizzying vertigo, the world spinning around me. My mother and Kale. The respected duchess and the common laborer. They had been in love. This secret, hidden world had existed right under my father's nose, but the final, devastating truth was yet to come. I turned the page, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The entry was dated 9 months before my own birth. The Duke has been away in the capital for 2 months, she wrote. And he will be gone for another 2. These weeks with Kale have been the only true happiness I have ever known. I have lived a lie for so long, but here, in his arms, by this lake, I am finally, truly myself. I know the risk we are taking is a terrible one. But I cannot find it in my heart to feel regret. I have given my husband an heir to his title, a daughter. He barely acknowledges. But the child I now carry, this child will be different. This child is not a product of duty. This child will be a product of love. This will be Kale's child. My child. Our secret. The journal slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor. The air left my lungs in a single, silent gasp. The room, the lake, the entire world receded into a dull, whirring sound in my ears. It wasn't just my eyes I shared with her. It was everything. I was not a Sterlingworth. My veins did not carry the Duke's cold, blue blood. I was the daughter of the blacksmith. The daughter of the man my father had banished me to. My entire life, every memory, every belief, was a lie. My rejection by the Duke was not just because of my size, it was because he must have suspected. He must have looked at me and seen the ghost of his wife's betrayal, the truth of my parentage, in my face. My punishment, his act of ultimate cruelty in sending me to the forge, was, in fact, an act of the most profound and unknowing poetic justice. He had not banished me. He had, in his blind hatred, sent me home. Time lost its meaning. I do not know if I sat in that dusty cottage for 1 hour or for 5, the diary lying open in my lap, my mother's faded scripted testament to a life I had never known. The world outside the grimy window, the placid lake, the whispering trees, was the same, but I had been fundamentally remade. Every memory I possessed of my life was now a lie, a carefully constructed stage play, and I was the only actor who hadn't known the truth. The Duke was not my father. The man whose coldness and disappointment had shaped my entire existence, the man whose blood I thought I carried, was a stranger. And Kale, the silent blacksmith, the man I was given to as a punishment, was my true father. The man whose love had been the secret, foundational reason for my very being. Grief was a tidal wave. I grieved for my mother, for the secret she had carried alone, for the love she had been forced to hide. I grieved for Kale, for the decades he had lived with the ghost of a love and a daughter he could never claim. And strangely, I grieved for the Duke, a man so consumed by pride and lineage that he could not see the truth in his own home, and whose final act of cruelty had been, in fact, an act of unwitting destiny. When I finally rose from the chair, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, golden fingers of light through the trees. My journey back to the forge was a pilgrimage through a new world. The woods were no longer a wild, intimidating place, but a sanctuary that held the secret of my conception. The rustling leaves did not whisper of my shame, but of my mother's hidden joy. This land, which I had always seen as the Duke's property, was not his at all. It was the land my father worked, the earth he shaped with fire and his own 2 hands. It was my birthright. I arrived back at the cottage as dusk was settling, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and bruised orange. The clang of the hammer had ceased. I saw Cale standing by the forge, washing his face and arms in a basin of water. I watched him, and for the first time, I was not looking at a stranger. I was searching for myself in him. I saw the line of his jaw, the set of his brow, the way he moved with a deep, grounded strength, and I saw a map of my own future, a truth my mirror had always hinted at but I had been too blind to see. He saw me approach, and I noticed a flicker of relief in his eyes, quickly masked. He had been worried. The thought was so new, so startling, that it almost made me stop. Someone had been worried about my safety. You were gone a long time, he said. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. I went for a walk, I replied, my voice steady. To my mother's old retreat by the lake. I saw his body stiffen, a subtle, almost imperceptible reaction. I had said the word, the name of the place where his entire world, and mine, had been created. That evening, the ritual was the same. He prepared the meal. I took my seat at the table. He took his stool by the fire. The silence between us returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a wall of ice. It was a shimmering curtain, waiting to be pulled back. The diary was heavy in the satchel at my feet. I knew I had to do it. I cleared my throat. Cale, I began, my voice a little shaky. You said you knew. Ilara. You said I have her eyes. He did not look at me, but I saw him nod almost imperceptibly, his gaze fixed on the fire. My mother's name, I continued, my heart pounding, was Lady Annalise Sterlingworth. Did you know her? He finally turned his head and looked at me. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were a storm of emotions he could no longer hide. He was shocked that I knew that I had made the connection. He thought his secret was safe. She was the Duchess, he said, his voice low and guarded. I worked on the estate. We spoke on occasion. You did more than speak, I said, my voice gaining strength. You loved her. He flinched as if I had struck him. He looked away, back at the fire. You do not know what you are talking about. Don't I? I reached into my satchel, my hand steady now, and pulled out the small, leather-bound journal. I did not open it. I did not need to. I simply walked to the great wooden table that separated us and placed it down. It landed with a soft, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room. He stared at the diary. He knew what it was. I could see the recognition, the dawning horror in his eyes. His carefully constructed walls of silence, the defenses he had built. For decades, crumbled to dust in an instant. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of such profound grief that it broke my heart. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of all its stoicism. I loved her more than my own life, he confessed to the fire. She was not a duchess to me. She was Ilara. My swan. She was kind and sad and beautiful, and she saw me. Not the blacksmith, not the laborer. Me. We had a few stolen seasons by that lake. It was a lifetime. He told me everything. He told me of her loneliness, of his love. He told me of her terror when she discovered she was pregnant, and of their shared, heartbreaking decision that she must end their affair and raise the child as the Duke's, to protect the baby from ruin. To protect him from the Duke's wrath, she promised she would find a way for me to at least see the child, he said, his voice cracking. To watch you from afar. But her health failed after you were born. And then she was gone. He fell. Silent, the weight of 30 years of loss filling the small cottage, and then, he finally whispered, looking at me with eyes full of a pain so deep I could barely stand to witness it, "You're F. The Duke, he sent you here. He sent you to me." I thought it was a test from God. The cruelest joke a devil could ever devise. To be given the daughter I could never claim, as my charge, as a living reminder of everything I had lost. I had to build a wall. I had to stay silent. Because if I let myself feel anything for you, Serafina, if I let myself love the daughter of the woman I had lost, I thought my heart would turn to ash. The full, terrible, beautiful truth was finally laid bare. His distance was not because I was a ghost of a love he had lost. It was because I was the living, breathing embodiment of it. His silence was not indifference, it was a shield. A shield to protect his own heart from the impossible agony of loving a daughter who could never know him as her father. All the anger, all the jealousy I had felt, dissolved into a wave of overwhelming compassion. I looked at this man, this strong, silent man who had loved my mother and who had carried this impossible burden alone for 3 decades. I stood up from the table. The space between us, once a chasm of misunderstanding, now felt like a sacred ground. I took my bowl of stew, walked past the chair where I had always sat, and moved to the hearth. I sat down on the low stool beside him, the warmth of the fire on my face. I did not touch him. I did not speak. I simply sat with him, in the quiet, sharing the space, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that now lay between us. I did not have a name for what I felt. It was not the love for a father I had never known. It was something new, something that was just beginning to form in the ashes of our shared grief. But for the first time in my life, I felt the unmistakable, unshakable feeling of family. The confession changed the very air we breathed. The silence that had defined our existence was shattered, and in its place, a torrent of words, stories, and shared memories rushed in to fill the void. The small cottage, once a quiet prison of 2 lonely souls, became a haven of late-night conversations by the fire. He told me about my mother. Not the distant, serene Duchess I remembered, but Alara. His Alara. He spoke of her wicked sense of humor, the way she would sneak out to meet him with her shoes covered in mud, laughing like a common girl. He described the intelligence in her eyes, her frustration with the gilded cage of her life, her passion for books and wild, open spaces. He spoke of her love not as a tragic secret, but as the most vibrant, defining force of his life. Through his stories, my mother was resurrected, not as a sad portrait on a wall, but as a living, breathing woman of courage and passion. I was not the daughter of a weak, sad lady. I was the daughter of a woman who had dared to love against all odds. In return, I told him of my life in the manor. I spoke of the loneliness, the endless dinners where I felt invisible, the cruel whispers, the suffocating weight of my title. I told him about the Duke, not as his master, but as the man who had failed us both. For the first time, someone listened to my story not with pity, but with a deep, knowing anger on my behalf. Cale's jaw would tighten, his hands clenching as I spoke. He was feeling the injustice of my life as his own. The dynamic between us was remade. The invisible wall was gone. He was no longer my keeper, and I was no longer his charge. We were something new, something for which there was no name. We were not father and daughter in the way the world understood it. Too many years had been stolen for that. We were 2 survivors, 2 halves of a story, finally piecing ourselves together. This newfound identity settled in my bones, giving me a strength I had never known. I was no longer Lady Serafina Sterlingworth, the Duke's shameful failure. I was Serafina, daughter of Annalise and Cale, a child of a secret, powerful love. The knowledge was a shield and a sword. I started to walk differently, my head held higher. I began to take a real interest in the forge, not just as a place of noise and fire, but as my father's world. I would watch him work, and he would explain the nature of the different metals, the purpose of each tool. I was learning the language of his life, the heritage that was truly mine. To give form to our new reality, we decided to embark on a project together. We would restore my mother's abandoned lakeside cottage. It felt right. We would take a place that had been born of secrets and sorrow and transform it into a testament to her memory and our future. We worked side by side for weeks. Cale, with his craftsman's skill, repaired the sagging porch and replaced the rotten timbers. I took on the interior. I scrubbed away the years of dust and neglect. I aired out the rooms, letting the fresh, clean scent of the lake and pine replace the smell of decay. I mended the faded curtains and polished the tarnished silver. With each act of restoration, I felt as if I were healing a part of my own past. Of my mother's past. It was during this time that our relationship found its true rhythm. While we worked, we talked. We planned. We even, to my astonishment, laughed. One afternoon, as I was trying to hang a particularly stubborn window shutter, he came to help me. Our hands brushed, and this time, there was no awkwardness, no charged silence. It was just a simple, warm, human contact. He looked at me, a small, genuine smile reaching his eyes for the first time. "You have her stubbornness, too," he said. And in that moment, being compared to her was not a source of pain, but a badge of honor. Our new life was a quiet, beautiful thing we were building together, far from the cruelties of the world I had left behind. But I had been foolish to think that world would simply let me go. The peace was shattered on a crisp autumn morning. A rider appeared on the path leading to the forge, his horse's hoofs churning the mud. He wore the dark green and silver livery of Stirlingworth Manor. He carried a sealed scroll, bearing the Duke's wax seal. My blood ran cold. Cale saw the rider and immediately came to my side, placing a protective hand on my arm. The rider, a young man I did not recognize, dismounted and presented the scroll to me with a bow, his eyes carefully averted. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The Duke's handwriting was as it had always been, sharp, cold, and imperious. The document was not a letter, it was a formal, legal summons. It stated that, as I had failed to return to my familial duties, my previous arrangement with his servant was now null and void. He declared my presence at the forge an act of willful defiance. Therefore, he had taken matters into his own hands to secure the family's honor. He had, the letter announced, finalized a marriage contract for me with the Baron von Hesse. An old, cruel, but incredibly wealthy man from the Northern Territories, known for his vast lands and his 3 previous wives who had all met untimely ends. The summons commanded my immediate return to the manor within 3 days to prepare for the wedding. The final paragraph was the poisoned dart, aimed with perfect precision. "Should you refuse to comply," my father had written, "I will be forced to conclude that you are being held against your will. The blacksmith Cale will be charged with the abduction and defilement of a noblewoman, a crime for which the punishment is hanging. The land his forge occupies will be seized, and his workshop will be razed to the ground. Your obedience will secure his life. Your choice." I was faced with an impossible choice, a new and more terrible cage. If I stayed, I would be condemning Cale, my father, to death and ruin. If I left, I would be walking back into a life of gilded imprisonment, sacrificing the only true family and happiness I had ever known. "I will not let him take you," Cale said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He had read the summons over my shoulder, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "I will burn this whole estate to the ground before I let him lay a hand on you." I looked at him, at the raw, protective fire in his eyes, and I felt a surge of love so fierce it almost brought me to my knees. He was ready to fight a war he could not possibly win for me, and in that moment, I knew I could not let him. The old Serafina, the timid girl from the ballroom, would have wept and surrendered. But she was gone. I had been broken and reforged, just like his iron. I would not be broken again, no, I said, my voice clear and steady, a strange calm settling over me. We will not fight him with fire and hammers. That is his way. We will fight him with his own weapons. He looked at me, confused. What weapons? I thought of the Duke's world, a world I knew better than anyone. A world built on secrets, on leverage, on the fear of public shame and the carefully balanced scales of power. He thinks I am still the frightened, useless girl he sent away. I said, a slow, cold smile forming on my lips. He has forgotten that I have spent my entire life in the company of wolves. It is time I showed him that I learned how to bite. The 2 days that followed were a crucible of frantic, focused activity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach, but for the first time in my life, it was overshadowed by a powerful, clarifying sense of purpose. I was no longer a pawn in my father's games. I was a player, and I had just been handed the one piece that could topple the king. Kale, my father, was a storm of protective fury. He wanted to barricade the cottage, to arm himself, to meet the Duke's force with his own. I had to place a hand on his arm, an arm corded with tense muscle, and meet his fiery gaze with my own calm one. No, I told him, my voice steady. If you meet him with a hammer, he will meet you with 100 soldiers. He expects that. He wants that. It would prove his narrative that you are a brute who has captured his daughter. We will not give him the story he wants to tell. Then, what do we do, Serafina? He asked, his voice raw with frustration. We cannot simply let him take you. I am going to write 2 letters, I said, asterisk asterisk. We spent that evening at the small wooden table, the firelight dancing on our faces. I, with my knowledge of the court's delicate and vicious politics, and he, with his grounded, practical wisdom. Together, we crafted our strategy. The first letter was addressed to Baron von Hesse. It was a masterpiece of subtle character assassination, aimed not at the Baron, but at myself. I wrote of my delicate constitution and melancholy humors, hinting at a deep-seated instability. I spoke of a hereditary sadness that ran through my maternal line, a polite euphemism for madness in our circles. I lamented my own unfortunate physical failings and my likely inability to produce the strong, healthy heirs a man of his stature would require. I made myself sound like the most undesirable bride in the territory, a damaged, unstable woman who would bring only shame and whispers to his noble house. I did not refuse his offer, I made him want to retract it himself. It was a poisoned chalice wrapped in a silk ribbon. The second letter was to the Duke. It was short, formal, and deceptively compliant. Father, I wrote, I have received your summons. I understand my duties. I will return to Stirlingworth Manor on the morning of the 3rd day to discuss the arrangements for my forthcoming marriage. Kale watched me seal the letters, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. This is a dangerous game, Serafina. It is the only game he understands, I replied. But these letters are just a distraction. They are the opening move. My real weapon, I said, patting the satchel where my mother's diary now lay hidden, is the one thing he fears more than anything, the truth. On the morning of the 3rd day, I dressed with a care I had not taken in years. I chose a simple but elegant dark blue traveling dress. I was not returning as a beggar or a prisoner. I was returning as an equal. Kale wanted to come with me, to stand guard at the gates, but I refused. No, this is a battle I must fight alone, in his study, on his terms, I told him as he helped me into the small cart we had borrowed from a neighboring farmer. This is between him and me. Between the daughter he cast out and the father she never knew he was. I looked at him, at this strong, silent man who was my true family. Wait for me, I said, always, he replied, his voice thick with Emotion, the journey to the manor was the inverse of the one I had taken months before. I was not a frightened girl being banished. I was a woman returning to war, armed with a truth more powerful than any sword. When I arrived, I was met with the cold, formal efficiency I remembered so well. I was escorted directly to the Duke's study, the very room where my life had been dismantled. He was there, standing by the fireplace, a smug, triumphant look on his face. And to my surprise, sitting in one of the leather armchairs, was Baron von Hesse himself, a stout, florid man with cruel, piggy eyes. They had been waiting for me, ready to finalize the transaction. Serafina, the Duke began, dispensing with any greeting. I am pleased you have seen reason. Baron von Hesse has graciously agreed to overlook your recent indiscretions. We will have the contracts signed today. I walked calmly to the center of the room, placing my satchel on the floor. I met my father's gaze. I am afraid you are mistaken, I said, my voice clear and ringing in the quiet room. I believe the Baron will be retracting his most generous offer. In fact, I suspect he has already received a letter from me, detailing the many reasons why an alliance with me would be unwise for his legacy. The Baron sputtered, his face turning a shade redder. He looked at the Duke, confused. The Duke's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flash of fury. What is the meaning of this? The meaning, I said, reaching into my satchel, is that I am not here to discuss my marriage. I am here to discuss my mother's. I pulled out the small, leather-bound journal and placed it on the polished surface of his great desk. It sat there between us, a quiet, powerful balm. I know everything, I said simply. The Duke stared at the diary, his face draining of all color. He knew the handwriting. That is nothing, he stammered. The ramblings of an unwell woman. Is it? I asked. Or is it the story of a lonely duchess, neglected by a husband obsessed with power and politics? A woman so starved for affection that she found it in the arms of a common laborer? A man she truly loved. A man who was kind and who saw her as more than just a broodmare for a noble title. The Baron von Hesse, realizing he had walked into a venomous family scandal, began to look for the door. I know about their love, I continued, my voice gaining strength. And I know about their child. My mother's daughter. His daughter. I looked directly at the Duke. I know that I am not your child. The confession hung in the air, a blade at his throat. The Duke was speechless, his carefully constructed world imploding around him. So this is my offer to you, I said, my voice cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. You will immediately draft a document formally freeing Cale from his indentured status and canceling his family's debt. In perpetuity. You will sign over the deed to my mother's lakeside cottage and the surrounding 50 acres of land to me. You will never, ever interfere in our lives again. We will be left in peace. And if I refuse, he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. If you refuse, I said, leaning forward slightly, this diary will not remain a secret. I will not just reveal the truth of my parentage. I will ensure that every one of your rivals, every gossip in the capital, every member of your church, hears the tragic story of the Duchess Annalise Sterlingworth. They will hear how her powerful husband's coldness and neglect drove her to despair and into the arms of another man. The story will not be about her infidelity. It will be about your failure. Your failure as a husband and as a man. You will not be a cuckold, father. You will be a monster. Your precious reputation, the one thing you have ever truly loved, will be shattered beyond repair. And I will be the one holding the hammer. He stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time. He saw not the overweight, disappointing girl, but the daughter of Annalise, with her fire, and the daughter of Chaol, with his unbreakable strength. He saw a woman who had been to hell and was not afraid of burning his world to the ground to protect her own. He was defeated. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by the hollow look of a king who has lost his kingdom. Without another word, he walked to his desk, took out a fresh piece of parchment, and began to write. I stood and watched as he signed away my freedom, my father's freedom, and my future. When he was finished, I took the documents. I did not thank him. I did not say goodbye. I turned, walked out of that cold, dark study, and did not look back. I walked through the silent, cavernous halls of Stirlingworth Manor for the last time. Not as a banished outcast, but as a free woman returning home, and so, the life that was meant to be my punishment became my salvation. The man I was given to as a keeper became my father, and the small cottage at the edge of the world became the center of my entire universe. My story taught me that our true value is not determined by our family name or the body we are born into, but by the courage we find when the world has done its best to break us. We are not the iron, we are the fire that reshapes it, but the question of how I won my freedom is one I still reflect on in the quiet hours of the night. When I stood in that cold study, holding my mother's diary in my hands, I held her pain, her secrets, and all the power that came with them. I had a choice. I could have walked away with the knowledge, content to live my life in peace. But I chose to use that truth as a sword to dismantle the Duke's world and secure my future. So I ask you, who have listened to my story with such kindness, what would you have done in my place? Was I right to use a secret born of love and pain as a weapon for my own liberation? Or was there another path, a more merciful one, that I was too blinded by my own hurt to see? I truly want to read your thoughts in the comments below. This space is for our community to share its wisdom. If you believe that finding your own strength is the ultimate victory, please show your support with a like on this video, for more stories about the secrets we keep and the courage it takes to tell them. Subscribe to Heartland Confessions and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment with us. And finally, if you know someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to forge their own destiny, please share the story with them. Thank you for listening.